Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Blockchain Governance, Technology is Not the Issue. My name is Emily, and I'm a member of the Hyperledger team here at the Linux Foundation. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, so if you need to drop off at any point, we will automatically send you a link to the recording via email within a day or two. At the bottom of your audience console are widgets that control all the movable and resizable content windows. You can click and drag the lower right-hand corner of each widget to change the size, and you can move the windows around to customize the layout to your preference. Starting with the icon on the left, the film reel controls the audio for this event, or it allows you to fast forward or rewind if you're watching this on demand. The Q&A widget allows you to submit questions to our speakers at any time during the presentation. We will try our best to answer as many of them as we can. If you're watching this on demand, you can still submit questions and we can respond via email. The chart icon controls the slide viewing window. The document widget contains links to resources we think you might find interesting, as well as a copy of today's slide deck. The person icon opens a window where you can learn more about today's guest speakers. The clipboard allows you to access our survey widget, which helps us collect valuable feedback. Please take a moment at the end of the presentation to answer a few questions about today's session. And finally, the question mark opens a help topic window in case you experience issues with the console. If you're joining us on a non-Ubuntu Linux machine, please keep in mind you may experience lags in slide advancement, and refreshing your browser might help. You can join us on Twitter using the hashtag LFWebinar, and don't forget to follow us at Hyperledger and at Linux Foundation. As I mentioned, keep an eye out for an email from us in the next day or so with a link to today's recording. That takes care of our housekeeping info. I'm pleased to introduce today's guest speakers, Jesse Chenard and Brendan Taylor. Jesse has been focused on using blockchain technology to solve real-world problems since founding MonetaGo in 2014. Earlier this year, MonetaGo deployed its Fraud Mitigation Network in India. Based on Hyperledger Fabric, it is one of the first blockchain networks anywhere in the world to be used for day-to-day operations in the financial services industry. As CTO, Brendan Taylor engineers MonetaGo's data and blockchain solutions. Coming from one of Europe's largest hedge funds, he managed the execution of a quant fund with over $1 billion USD AUM and built automated Forex trading systems from the ground up. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jesse and Brendan.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you everyone on the call. This is Jesse Chenard speaking. Brendan is right beside me here. Today's webinar that the fine folks at the Linux Foundation, Hyperledger, have asked us to discuss is blockchain governance, and I think to share some of our experiences that we've had with the network that we've taken live, and as well as some other similar ones that we've been looking at proposing. There's a picture of both of us. Again, what we're looking to share here is really some of the tips and tricks that we use to get the participants of our initial network to the table, but then also I think some of the challenges that we've encountered as we talked about expanding the network, both from a functionality standpoint, but as well as adding participants when we hadn't really planned for that from the outset. So a little background about MonetaGo. As Emily mentioned, we were founded in 2014. We are headquartered in New York City. Most of our research and development happens here. We come from a very strong background, both myself and startups, but then most of the team coming from a variety of different sort of companies, mostly in the finance, banking, capital markets, and payments and settlements side of things. In addition to our New York office, we also have a subsidiary in Mumbai. They are responsible for sales and implementation and support. We're kind of the opposite of most companies that operate with an Indian presence in that we develop in New York and sell into the Indian market. As a company, we went through a slight evolution, or in sort of startup speak, we went through a couple different pivots. In our initial iteration of the company, we were looking at how we could leverage public blockchains and the tokens or currencies that were available on them to affect currency conversions and money transfers. What we quickly learned was that although it was possible, and in some cases, we had the ability to do arbitrage across the different markets and bring in sort of very below cost money transfers and currency conversions, we also realized that the market that we were trying to sell to, which was financial institutions, still had a large number of concerns, and in some cases were precluded from working with companies that handled cryptocurrencies or tokens. As we had set that company up, we had established presence and bank accounts in a number of different regions around the world. And I think luckily for us, it was right around the time when Hyperledger was launched, and the blockchain buzz in the world started to pick up, and went from sort of Bitcoin bad to blockchain good. And one of those areas that we had set up, like I said, was India. And we started to receive a tremendous amount of inbound interest from banks there. They had obviously a number of concerns in that marketplace. Bitcoin had a very big stigma attached to it, and it's being highly regulated. There were also a number of concerns as to what the Reserve Bank stance was on Bitcoin itself. So what we did was we looked at what the existing laws and the frameworks around data privacy and sort of regulatory structures were, and came out with the notion of a private permission blockchain, which at the time was kind of novel. And then also the other piece that I think was very important from the Reserve Bank perspective was not introducing alternate currencies of value. So no tokens on the blockchain, basically just leveraging it more from an information and business process management standpoint. Our first pass at it was very similar to a number of the other consortiums out there or groups that have formed up, was to try and get a critical mass of the major banks in India onto a common interbank private permission blockchain. What we found was that trying to offer the Swiss Army knife of blockchains was somewhat confusing for these folks. And so we had trouble getting, for lack of a better word, consensus as to what the right use cases were. There's a number of different use cases that were being put out there and proposed, but we typically couldn't get all of the banks to agree to what use cases were first and what have you. And then what we started to look at as well, and this is where we wound up doing some work quite closely with the Reserve Bank of India and their research arm, was how to get the regulatory buy-in. A lot of the questions from the banks were, okay, this is technically possible, but where does the Reserve Bank sit on this, or where do the various different regulators sit on that? So along with the help from a number of people in the industry, we worked with the Reserve Bank to come up with a white paper that looked at the permissible applications of blockchain technology and the ones that the government thought that would be of interest and things that they could support. So that regulatory buy-in we found is, at least working in the financial services space, extremely key. Typically the first question is, after you get past the yes, this is a good idea, this is something we'd like to buy, is what's the legal opinion on this? Does it sort of meet existing regulatory requirements? Are there going to be changes that are required? And who's going to handle that? So once we had started to get some clarity as to what use cases the Reserve Bank itself could support, then we started to try and figure out how to get those use cases live. And so we started to slim down our different sort of potential projects and bucket them into ones where we had broad support from typically the market leaders. So those were applications like trade finance workflows, information settlement to accompany existing payment rails, to do any number of different things, not the least of which being able to automatically update ERP systems, core banking systems, accounting systems. Obviously, contract exchange and a few others were also natural use cases. As we were going through that process, we were introduced to 3 receivables marketplaces. So for those of you not familiar with invoice factoring or receivables financing, it's where you have a small supplier who needs cash flow and maybe has a 90-day payable from a large corporate buyer. So they take that invoice to a financier, typically their bank or NBFC, non-banking financial company, and they offer it for sale to them at a discount. So if I had a $100 invoice, the financier may say, okay, I'll give you $90 today, and then at maybe the due period, I will collect the $100 and keep my 10. So these 3 receivables financing marketplaces were in the process of going through the last steps to go live. And they realized that they had a communication issue between them. The communication issue was that it was completely permissible for a supplier to go and offer their invoice across each of these different platforms. But when when the supplier then needed to or accepted a bid on one of their invoices, the other ones needed to know not to accept subsequent offers from other financiers. So classic sort of double spend problems, but more in the real world scenarios, not the ones you're used to in the crypto side of things. So what we proposed to them, and I'll let Brendan get into the technical details of it in some subsequent slides here, but what we proposed to them was a common network amongst them that basically answered or addressed their concerns around the privacy and the confidential nature of the information in the invoices, but also provided subsequently a very actually kind of a low-cost mechanism, even though, as many people have said, couldn't you do this with a central service? When they did the cost analysis on it, a centralized service with the overhead and the auditing and what have you, actually came out to be much, much more expensive than the solution that we deployed for them. Interestingly, in India, we've started now to get the attention of the rest of the factoring market. So this is where some of the challenges have come into play. Where initially the three customers thought we were building a network, specifically tailored for them, although we do retain rights to it and what have you. But as the industry started to get word of what we were doing for these three marketplaces, we started to get interest from some of the largest factors in India to join the network. And so that, of course, presented a raft of challenges as to how can we, who is allowed to join, what are the economics, are the early participants remunerated in any way for access to what they sort of think of as their network. So those are a couple of the things that I think we'll touch on as well. Now taking this network to other regions in the world, obviously we're a little bit more prepared and have got some good experience, but I think that's one of the key considerations that I brought up actually a number of times when discussing this is sort of establishing a good governance system so that it's flexible for the addition of different functionality, different participants, and that there are clear guidelines and rules for how that happens. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan now to dive into a little of these points in detail.
Hi, everyone. This is Brendan Taylor, CTO. So thanks very much, first of all, for taking the time to listen to us. So what I'm going to do is I'm, first of all, going to walk you through some of the generic problems that we faced along our evolution in order to actually get any kind of use case live and in production. Bear in mind that this is all within the context of offering enterprise-grade blockchain services for financial industries specifically. So I know a lot of listeners out there may not specifically be in financial services, and you may not be blockchain service providers. You may actually be end users of different kinds, but hopefully some of the learnings, tips and tricks that we've got here for you might be useful. So as Jesse was mentioning, it's been kind of a journey for the company over the last 3.5 years. Making a couple pivots and really trying to find what the right initial use case was to deploy the technology. And some of the real barriers that we initially faced were the ones you can see here on screen. So lack of DLT education, that's something that I'm sure all of you have come across. The industry and the technology itself is still very much in its nascent stages. And although every bank that you may speak to or every large corporation probably has now a decent knowledge of what the technology is and what it does, that certainly wasn't the case when we were starting out a couple of years ago. Part of the issue remains that although they may have a high-level understanding of the technology, a lot of the companies that you might end up dealing with don't really understand what's actually involved in implementing it. The next problem along that we had some real focus on is around privacy. So the three receivables exchanges that we've been working with, obviously there is some real concerns that if you're broadcasting your information out to the rest of this network, a lot of that information can be highly sensitive, especially in the financial services industry. It could be personally identifiable information, payment information, transactional, contractual, lots of different kinds of stuff could be being passed back and forth between the participants. So privacy is really concern number one for us. And that was a large part of our evolution away from public networks in order to be able to provide a framework that ensures complete privacy of the information amongst the participants. Next is competitive concerns. So obviously there are various types of networks that you could implement, some of them vertical, such as a supply chain use case, which involves a lot of different types of participants. It could be the inclusion of producers, suppliers, buyers, things like banks themselves and shippers, etc. So that would be like a vertical use case. But the use case that we have put into place here is very much a horizontal one, where it's participation from a bunch of competitors who are providing the same service. And it's obviously beneficial for them to share information in some way. But none of the competitors want to give away any kind of sensitive information about who their customers are, what kind of volumes they're processing. So there is a definite challenge in appeasing those concerns. Ultimately, the participants need to realize that the value of the information that they gain from participating is much higher than the potential loss of the information that they give away. Number 4 and 5 here, defining ROI and cost-benefit analysis, they kind of go hand in hand. So one of the big challenges for us was to be able to define the value of this technology. And I think people are still very much struggling with this today because of its nascency. There just isn't enough data available as to what the technology is actually capable of doing, and there's no access to individual operational data from the participants by a service provider such as ourselves. So we're a little bit shooting in the dark when we're trying to define what the value of this is. And it may be that there isn't actually even any incumbent service which you could compare this against. So in the case of this network that we put in place, the information of the amount of fraud that was happening across the exchanges is just not something that's available because the exchanges were not tracking it themselves. So defining the ultimate value of the system is a little bit sort of finger in the air kind of thing. But as more of these deployments happen over time and we get better data, then we can start providing some real analysis on the operational side of things and doing that cost-benefit analysis to ensure that using this type of technology is actually the right way of doing things. And lastly, lack of collaboration. So one of the issues that we consistently came across in trying to sell these products is that everyone wants to own the technology. Everyone wants to use the technology and leverage it as a differentiator. And as most of you are probably well aware, the democratic nature of distributed ledger technology is kind of at odds with that. It is beneficial to the entire industry, and it needs to be sort of on an even thing amongst everyone who participates. So using it as a differentiator is kind of at odds with that. So that's been a struggle to actually convince the ultimate users of the technology that it's really a benefit to all, and you should do it in a collaborative manner rather than trying to leverage the technology to get a step up above your competitors. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual production solution that we've got into place, and then the specifics of how we overcame the barriers to this implementation. So as Jesse was mentioning, the solution is around eliminating fraud in receivables financing. So the case being where a supplier is able to offer the same invoice for financing across multiple exchanges simultaneously, how does one exchange know that one of the other exchanges has actually already financed the invoice and therefore should not process it on their own exchange? So that requires sharing information of what's being financed amongst each other. And again, going back to the concerns around privacy and competitive information, they don't really want to share that information that contains sensitive aspects to it. So what we do is we create an invoice fingerprint, and that is essentially just hashed information of the invoices. So we're using the blockchain as an attestation to some fact happening, rather than using it to store the clear text information itself. And we do this in a couple of different ways. So it's not quite as simple as just taking a hash of the overall invoice fields. We actually take hashes of combinations of the different fields. So that not only allows us to identify when a specific invoice has been financed somewhere else, but it also allows us to identify when a similar invoice has been financed somewhere else. The point being that if a supplier wanted to get around or if they were aware that we were doing a duplicate check on their invoices and they wanted to get around that, they would be able to just change a single digit in the invoice ID or one of the decimal points in the invoice amount, and that would completely change the hash, and therefore they would not be identified in their duplicate financing. So by identifying similar invoices that are being financed, we are also catching those cases where they are surreptitiously trying to change some of the fine details on them. As we mentioned, that preserves absolute privacy across all of the exchanges, and ultimately, as more people join the network, more banks, factors, and discounters join the network, they can be assured that all this information that is being broadcast amongst the network is not containing any sensitive information at all. And Jesse mentioned it's pretty low cost, simple integration. We try to abstract as much of the blockchain complexity to our clients as possible. I'll touch on this a little bit more in a minute. But one of the other issues you have is because the technology is new, the actual end users are not able to implement it themselves, and therefore they need to have this offered to them initially on a kind of SaaS basis, so that they're able to really abstract away that complexity and just have simple endpoints in which they can send and retrieve their information from. So how did we actually get to implement this particular solution? As we mentioned, it's fully live in production. It's enterprise grade. There's real business information being broadcast across this network. So some of the ways that we actually were able to implement this was by really finding a smaller scale business need initially to deploy on. A lot of the work that you hear about being done on blockchain technology is sort of very blue sky, large scale, dealing with extremely complex solutions. So we really focused on a real business needs with a relatively small amount of volume initially, so that we had no concerns on the technology side that we would be able to handle it, but that would be able to scale quickly over time to handle much larger volumes. As we said, there's a limited number of participants on this deployment. We had, as the founding members, the 3 exchanges. It's obviously a lot easier to get 3 participants to agree to the rules and the economics of a network than it would be if you had hundreds. And we also made it very lightweight from the cost perspective. So we use a transactional method for charging. So there's no real upfront capex to joining the network. One of the other problems that we have in using a technology that requires a network effect is you need to have no barriers to entry for the entire industry. And there is likely to be a wide range of sizes in the participants that join your network. Some of them may be processing just a handful of transactions a year or a month. Others may be processing millions a day. So if there was a heavy upfront capex to actually deploy this amongst all participants, then that unfairness to the smaller players would obviously present a barrier to them participating and avoid the network reaching kind of a critical mass. So having that pay-as-you-go model has been pretty beneficial to actually get these things going. So on the governance side of things, I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second again, but for this particular use case being a horizontal use case where there's no sort of real natural administrator or someone who would provide that governance role, and there is also no value or real sort of sensitive information being exchanged amongst the participants, we can afford to have a more lightweight governance model initially. So our governance model is administered by us with agreement and buy-in by all the participants, but it's essentially a code of conduct. So everyone agrees to behave in a certain way and agrees to what the repercussions would be if they break those rules in that code of conduct. There's no real heavy legal framework required to actually put that in place. They don't need to have an official consortium or association or federation in place before actually being able to join this network. We can go ahead with that lighter governance model. And as I mentioned, to begin with, we are providing that administration role to the network. The longer term vision for these networks is obviously to be able to hand over that administrative role to the network participants themselves. However, there is a high level of hand-holding required at the beginning to actually get them off the ground. So that can be a gradual process, right? It doesn't need to be a day one, this is what you guys need to do. It's super complicated and difficult, and you're going to have to provision your own servers and do upgrades all together at the same time. We take care of all of that aspects for them to make that simple. So one of the larger issues, sort of more fundamental issues of the technology for the enterprise space that I want to discuss quickly is around this kind of dual personality of DLT. There's been a whole bunch of different versions and platforms of blockchains and DLTs put out there. The enterprise-focused ones such as Hyperledger Fabric and R3's Corda and Quorum all have a slightly different focus on how they go about implementing this technology. But it's really not just about sharing information amongst the participants. It's about providing guarantees of integrity to the information and the processes that occur throughout the network. So the two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum are the initial sort of broadcast model that Hyperledger was focused on initially from version 1.0. Which allows for, at least if not a global broadcast amongst the entire network, a broadcast within an individual chain or a group of participants. And the other side was a peer-to-peer mechanism, which is more what an R3's Corda is focused on, where you're exchanging private information, private transactional information directly from one participant to another, and not really providing that overall broadcast or storage of attestation for the network. So the broadcast model being exceptionally good for providing those guarantees and that integrity to the information and process, and the peer-to-peer aspects being great for guarding privacy of the information that is being processed. So as I mentioned, a lot of these businesses, certainly enterprise and banks, have a huge focus on privacy and maintaining the security around that data. So that broadcast model really was at odds with what they're trying to do. But the great thing is that we're now approaching a space where with the evolution in Hyperledger Fabric and the newer versions, we now have this concept of private collections. So we can create this hybrid model which provides the best of both worlds. So we have that chain-wide storage of attestations to what has happened in a private setting. So a transaction which contains details of a trade or a contract can be exchanged directly from one participant to another using a private collection, and the details of that, the hash of it, can be stored on the entire chain for that attestation of the actual truth. So that gives us a nice balance between those two opposing forces, and that's really going to allow us to implement a lot more complex use cases, which up until now a lot of businesses have been reticent to participate in because of those issues. So what does all of this mean for governance? And again, this is kind of from our perspective as a technology provider. Some of you may have different experiences than we have had, but this is what our sort of approach to this has been and what our views are. And I know this isn't particularly useful bit of information here, but it's very much true. The framework and the complexity of the governance model that you need really is highly dependent on the use case and the service that's actually being provided by the network. Our approach has been to start with use cases which don't require that heavy governance framework and can have a lighter touch, and ultimately progress onto those heavier ones over time as frameworks get put in place and regulations change, etc. The primary concern of governance for us should really be around the access control to the network and establishing that code of conduct. That's really it. They're not meant to be legal litigators in any way whatsoever. They're just meant to provide that framework for the code of conduct and establish the rules of who can participate, how they can participate, and what happens if they misbehave. That's really it. Ultimately, especially for transactional networks and vertical networks, there should still be bilateral and multilateral contracts in place between the participants. That doesn't come included with the blockchain. So when one bank is dealing with another bank, they should still have a master services agreement or an ISDA or whatever it might be in place that allows them to transact with each other. And should there be any kind of need for dispute resolution, ultimately that contract is what is used to resolve that issue. It's not kind of an automated legal framework where the chain code or whatever other type of smart contract is the ultimate decider of what happens in a transaction. Technology does and can and does go wrong all the time, right? So there needs to be some legal framework backing these transactions to fall back on in case of errors with the network or issues with the code that's being used. And so for us, DLT really remains a protocol for information exchange and processing. It's not that autonomous legal framework in its own right that a lot of people, well, at least hope it to be or think it to be initially. Maybe in the longer term, as contractors' code becomes more accepted and becomes more readable and people become more fluent in reading chain code, maybe it does take on a heavier role from that perspective. But for the time being, we're big believers that the technology should really just be used as that protocol of information exchange and not a legal framework. So some of the wider issues that the industry experiences as a whole, not necessarily specific to us, although we have come across a lot of these issues as well. So number one, innovation objectives being misaligned. This is an issue where a lot of the companies, especially the larger enterprises and the banks that are looking at this stuff, have an innovation team in-house whose objectives are not necessarily in sync with that democratic aspect of blockchain. And that decentralization that is required with it. So the mandate of a lot of innovation departments is to provide a differentiator through technology for their firm, for their bank. And when you initially approach a company with a solution that uses this technology, you're almost always pushed to those innovation teams. And those innovation teams have made already other investments in other firms providing similar technology. And therefore, there's always a misalignment of their goals with what the wider industry goals should be. Competition among solutions, an obvious one. Again, there are lots of platforms available out there from Corda and Fabric, certainly for the enterprise side, but all the way on the public side, there's almost hundreds of them to choose from now. So there is difficulty in achieving consensus among these participants as to what protocol should be used. As I said, a lot of these companies have actually made investments in some of these technology providers and therefore are reluctant to let go of those investments if the rest of their industry is moving towards a different solution. So coming to consensus as to what the right protocol to implement for an industry is critical and certainly a very difficult thing to come to. Legal complexity, an obvious one, and that's on a few different levels, not just from establishing governance for a complex use case, which does require sort of a heavy legal hand in establishing a federation or an association or whatever it might be. There's a lot of legal complexity that could be involved in doing those types of things, and legal complexity takes time to resolve. It's simple as that. So trying to avoid that legal complexity is pretty critical to getting your use case off the ground from day one. Long sales cycles, at least in the business that we're in, financial services, this is a disadvantage to a lot of startups and innovators out there. If you're selling your product to a small business, you may get a buy-in on day one, and they may start using it the next day. If you're going to sell that same product to a bank, it's just, even if you get buy-in from the business owner for the particular product at the bank, it's going to take them a real long time to assign those budgets and get approval from all the way up the chain and do whatever audits they need to do and onboard the vendors, etc. So it just takes time to get that stuff in place. And that's difficult if you're a small firm. So that's definitely been a struggle for us, but now we're finally getting places, so we can appreciate that. Regulatory reform, we've been relatively lucky, we've actually architected a lot of our solutions to be compliant with the existing regulations. But in the case where the existing regulations create a barrier to implementing your solution, that regulatory reform could take a significant amount of time to be put in place. In some of the places where we're operating, we've been fortunate enough to actually have regulatory reform happen extremely quickly, where it's been needed, and we've participated in sort of giving reasons as to why that regulatory reform is needed, but that's pretty rarely the case. It's normally going to take an extremely long time for a regulator to gather enough information and data to understand really how their regulations need to evolve and change. So we could expect that to take a long time. And the final point, enterprise integration. This is kind of on two levels. The first level, as I had mentioned before, is around the knowledge base of the participants being high enough to actually implement the technology themselves. The promise of this technology is to actually allow the participants to implement their own interfaces and systems to participate in these networks. That requires an extreme amount of knowledge to do that today, right? Because the technology is young and evolving, that there is a huge lack of those skills within the participants of these networks. And therefore, it needs to be provided on a SaaS basis initially until they are able to acquire the skills needed to implement their own infrastructure. And the second level of that is around integration of the actual use cases with their existing systems. So every company uses an ERP of some kind, and a lot of these use cases, whether it's trade finance or contract exchange or supply chain management, whatever it is, all of them are using their own ERP of some flavor. And it's very difficult to completely displace those systems in order to replace them with new interfaces. So you have to integrate these networks into those existing applications. Because there's a huge range of these applications, that also just takes time. It's not an obvious thing to do. It requires specialist knowledge of each of the individual ERPs to build plugins. So that is a challenge as well. So finally, what's kind of our advice from our perspective? So the way that we've achieved our success is to target industries with a high concentration of market leaders, or even industry associations. So if there is an existing association for your industry, dealing with that association is much better than going bottom up from the industry participants themselves. And that can really facilitate an accelerated deployment for your use case. So, and again, with that concentration, if you have to get the buy-in of less than 10 participants that dominate a particular industry or market, that's going to be a lot easier than dealing with an industry that may be spread across hundreds of participants. So that has been a real advantage to deploying our use case. solve for the specific business requirements over the technology. It's not technology that we're selling here. We're selling products that are addressing real business needs. And the people that you need to sell to, which I'll talk about in a second here, are the people that benefit from solving that problem. If you're selling the technology in general, you're going to have a real hard time getting adoption from them. So it's a business-first approach from us rather than technology-first. Keep complexity low and gradually build on top of success. So a small win is much better than no win at all. If you start with the small wins and you start building another small win on top of that small win, you'll get somewhere in time. But if you try to tackle too much initially straight from the get-go, you're going to have a real hard time getting a buy-in from everyone that you need to. Architect for success at all levels of participation. So this is kind of really more relevant to that vertical kind of network where you have a lot of different roles participating in a use case. So something like supply chain management. You need to incentivize everyone that needs to participate in order to get them to join the network. If the network is architected to provide a great benefit to just one subset of the roles, and you expect everyone else to join the network to make that happen for them, but there's no real benefit to them, again, it's just not going to happen, right? People are extremely busy. They have limited resources, limited budgets. You need to make it interesting to every single type of role that's going to participate in the network. Sell to the employees in a business who benefit most from the solution, not to the innovation team. So I'd spoken about that a little bit, and this is pretty critical. We are selling a product that is solving a real problem and a specific problem. So you need to sell that to the people who are going to benefit from having that problem solved. If you end up selling to an innovation team, they are going to try and leverage your technology, your solution as a differentiator for the bank, again, which is not what you want. So selling directly to those employees who need the solution most is extremely important. And lastly, validate your ideas and approach across the industry. So when you come up with ideas, it's extremely important to socialize those ideas with the ultimate users of that network. If you architect this in isolation, in a vacuum, the chances of you getting the incentives right for all those participants is extremely slim. Not only that, but the industry may already be working on another solution that you're not aware of because you're not talking to them. So talking to the industry as a whole is extremely important in getting that buy-in for your idea before you even embark on actually building it. So I think that more or less concludes what we wanted to give you, and we're going to open it up to a Q&A session. And I'll move over to those questions and start taking a look at those. Hopefully what I told you so far has been relatively useful, and you've gotten some good tips out of it.
So I'll take the first question here from one of the participants. It's, do you develop any special criteria for evaluating the credibility of each user or node? In this case, because our solution is very much focused on the receivables financing or factoring space within the Indian marketplace, we obviously look for the bar is that they have to be factors. And that's very easy for us to identify because if you're in that business in India, you actually have to register with the Reserve Bank of India and get, I think, some sort of certificate around that. So in that case, it's quite straightforward. But I think in more complex use cases that we've seen and that we're working on, it's being in a specific industry. So whether you're a credit rating agency or a depository or a large corporate or a bank or what have you, those kinds of profiles pretty much self-select. And because these are private permission blockchains focused on somewhat specific use cases, it's pretty straightforward typically to identify whether they're a valid participant. And then I think also establishing rules and sort of codes of conduct for the participants. So when there is abuse or misuse of the network, it's very easy to shut those participants off.
So the next question, I'm going to take this one. How exactly do you guys handle privacy between different orgs? Creating a channel for each set of participants, participating orgs is obviously not scalable. So we have a single channel for our receivables financing use case, the fraud mitigation use case, a single channel between all participants. This being a complete broadcast model and not containing any private information. The idea is to broadcast that information amongst all the participants. But as I had touched on, we're obscuring the clear text information by using only hashes, so that when an identical invoice is being submitted to the network from different participants, the hashes will resolve and match in the network. But having those hashes distributed amongst all the participants doesn't give them any information as to what the contents of that invoice were. Hyperledger is obviously evolving relatively quickly, and the issue around using channels to enable privacy is a little bit of a complex one, but I don't feel personally that it was the right kind of architecture to enable that. And the architecture that Fabric is moving towards now is much more capable and much more appropriate for enabling that kind of privacy, which is with the use of private collections within a channel. So the private data is held amongst the participants of a transaction only, and it's only the hashes that are being broadcast within a channel itself as attestation of what actually happened in that transaction. So that's kind of taking it back to the core use of these blockchains and using them as a proof, a store of proofs and attestations of the truth, rather than a store of the actual information itself.
So I'll get the next one here. Considering the innovation teams would be involved in the evaluation of DLT solutions, how did you manage to keep the feature set unbiased and valuable to every participating organization? And I think Brendan touched a little bit on this. One of the things we've learned over the last, I'd say, year and a half is to stop saying blockchain. Because when you say blockchain, you get shunted to the innovation team or DLT. You get shunted to the innovation team, which obviously is very excited and enthused about the tech, but typically doesn't have budget of their own other than small amounts for R&D. So we reverse it and we don't go in and talk about DLT or blockchain. We talk to the head of trade finance or supply chain management and ask them if they'd like to reduce the instances of fraud on their invoice financing business. Typically, the answer is always yes. And then once we dive into it a little bit more and explain the network, how it works, how we're getting the critical mass of participants on, at that point, we then get passed over to the innovation team. And it's kind of interesting because at that point, then they've got a business sponsor for the project. Typically, the business sponsor will be able to get the budget for it. And when you go in and you start talking to the innovation team and they discover that it's actually a blockchain-based solution, they get excited as well because most of them have been looking for a blockchain-based project to actually work on and put into production. So it's a little bit of a different approach than just going to the innovation team and saying, "Hey, evaluate our DLT solution." We go to the business head and say, "Here's our application or product. Is this of value to you?"
The next question is, how many member organizations are in the network? Does each member run one or more Fabric peers? How are decisions about membership services decided? So the first part of that, how many member organizations? So initially we had 3. We have now onboarded multiple others. So we are in contractual phases with various other participants who will be using the system shortly. As to does each member run one or more Fabric peers? Our current setup is to actually run multiple peers per organization. And that's purely for redundancy of their connection into the network. So this is obviously dependent on what your particular use case is and how you think that it's best to architect it. From our perspective, we wanted to provide resiliency in the individual connections into the network. So we have redundancy among the peers for each organization. How are decisions about membership services decided? So what we did is we established that code of conduct framework amongst the participants. And that was very much just a case of sitting down with the founding members and agreeing on a set of rules that should apply to the network. And that set of rules includes what type of organization should be able to join and what behavioral rules do they need to adhere to. So whatever use case you have, if it is an industry-wide use case, you, again, need to avoid any kind of bias into who can join this network. If the network is to be closed to a small subset of an industry in order for them to gain a leg up, then you're not going to really enable that full value of the network effect that you need by using this type of system. People are still going to have to support multiple different implementations for the industry. So that's pretty important. Next question, how is your solution really different than a traditional SaaS offer with a regular centralized database? Are participants of your DLT able to use it without you? So that's an excellent question, and one that's a little bit tricky to answer. So as I had touched on a little bit, one of the major hurdles that we have is getting participants who actually have the skill set to implement their own infrastructure. So the SaaS-based offering that we have is segregated by participants. So every participant has their own dedicated environment and their own dedicated accounts, but it is cloud-based. And we have administrative control of those accounts to actually implement any upgrades and updates to the system. The longer term goal being to actually be able to hand off this administrative role to the organization itself. However, the reality is today, organizations are just not ready to do that. So it will take some time to get to that point where people are actually able to realize the real benefit of having this decentralization and distribution by taking ownership of their own infrastructure. You know, that's one of the fundamental difficulties of blockchain and DLT is that you're taking a service and you're putting the onus of operating that service onto the user. You know, it's like telling users today who use online banking, you know, you guys now need to actually operate your own bank and you need to hide your own cash under your pillow and do your own finances. You're not allowed to use another service provider, right? A lot of people out there just don't have the skill sets to do that. So it will take time to get to the point where people are actually able to operate these types of networks completely independently from an administrator. Next question, what happens when chains get very large, especially for such a large number of transactions? Again, so this is kind of an evolving topic with a lot of these platforms, and how do you deal with an ever-increasing database? So I think everyone is perfectly aware that there needs to be some kind of pruning mechanism in place to be able to archive transactions and the ledger itself at various points in time. So as to what the actual mechanism, that is still being developed by Fabric. Some people may actually implement that in-house. You could potentially archive the whole thing and recreate a new chain, being preceded with some of the transactional information from the old one. There's various ways that you can do it. And I'm not saying that we have the right answer for that today, but it is an evolving space. It's not something that we need to address immediately with our particular use case, but we do have a solution for that, which will be implemented in the coming months.
So I'll take the next one here. Question asked, is China or Africa the next market for you in terms of volume of invoices? Yes and yes. Also, other areas where receivables financing is a high growth sort of product. So in general, I think the largest volume of invoice financing, at least on a dollar value, typically happens in the UK or Europe. But we also see that there are massive opportunities as this is a very attractive credit mechanism for small suppliers in regions that maybe don't have credit bureaus or credit histories or good access to strong data about the business itself. So those markets that we see, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, are all, I think, pretty high on the list. And then again, of course, you know, it goes back to how do you manage to get that network effect within each of these markets? And as we get more and more historical data on sort of the ROI and the number of frauds that we're preventing, you know, I think that gets easier and easier. But yeah, I think anywhere where there's a high volume of export or import happening, multiple sort of MSMEs or SMEs are all regions where we see that there's a good business case for deploying networks like this.
Next question is, I know the technology, but I don't know the industry. So when you say talk to the industry, how do you approach it? So I guess it's very useful to have connections within the industry to start with, to start speaking to people. But as I said, your first target should be any industry associations that there might be for the particular industry. So whether it's factoring or receivables financing, there are often industry associations that are put in place that have participation from the main market players in that industry. So sending an email, giving a call to them to see if they would be open to discussing your ideas, I think is the initial way to go. If you have a large number of participants in an industry, then talking to each one by one is obviously also difficult. But you may actually socialize your ideas with any one of them to get feedback prior to talking to that industry association to ensure that you're kind of on the right track and you're thinking about this the right way. But in terms of actually approaching them, I can't really give you any pointers there. It's really, a lot of it may be cold calling or just emailing around or using your connections to actually get an audience.
So next question is, how do you educate decision makers, as most are not aware of the potentials of what DLT can achieve? And, I think that goes back to what I said before. We educate the decision makers by selling them on the value of the application, not necessarily the underlying blockchain or the protocol that it's running on. So, being able to spell out a clear business case and show the efficiency of the network is really how we sway the decision makers. And again, we're typically talking to business or product leads, in this case, more around trade finance or supply chain management, not the IT teams.
Next question, why did you choose India as your first market? So part of it was opportunistic in the sense that we had established a presence in India for our initial business around cross-border B2B transactions using digital assets. So we already had a good connections with the banks in India. However, India is a great initial proving ground for this kind of technology for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it's very digitally progressive. So they have a lot of what some people might say are radical, but they have a lot of initiatives which are government-driven or otherwise to digitize the economy in a lot of different ways. So you have the Aadhaar system, which is digital identity for everyone. And I know there's some issues around using Aadhaar now going around the courts, but the Aadhaar is not the only example of these types of initiatives. So India is a very digitally progressive market compared to others. Not only that, but having a younger industry in financial services there compared to, say, Europe or the US, you have a lot more ingrained technology in the older markets. So it's much more difficult to actually displace that technology and introduce new technology. Whereas the Indian businesses are much more willing to actually leapfrog generations of technology and implement the latest and greatest.
So next question here comes in. This is funny, well, not funny, but interesting. How did you finance the development without the recourse of an ICO? So I've been starting companies for about 20 years, well predating ICOs. So it's the standard bootstrap. Everybody eats a little bit of ramen and mac and cheese for dinner for weeks and months on end, and then once we started to find a product market fit, and myself and a few others put up initial capital to get things off the ground. But once we started to find the product market fit, it's the standard sort of startup story. So going to angels, either who you have personal connections to, friends and family, if you will. But then also in our case, many of our private investors come from the finance industry themselves. So they either they're big believers in where this is going to go, or they want to get close to this technology and learn more, and making an investment was a way to do that. And then now, of course, now that we've got product market fit and revenue, it's the standard sort of working with institutional investors to grow and scale it. The nice part is that we are now in a revenue generation mode. So there is a pretty straightforward path to profitability, which is nice. Anecdotally, one of my former investors, as I was talking to him about what we were doing, he said, well, why don't you just raise an ICO? And to which I replied, well, my customers pay me in real money, so I don't necessarily need to go have an alternate currency in between.
So I think this might be the last question that we have time for. But if any of you want to continue the conversation, we're obviously open to chatting with many of you over email, and we can get you details of that just after this. So the last question, you mentioned many times that it took you time to move from one phase to another. Could you please elaborate on that? Roughly how much time it took you to go through the evolution mentioned at the beginning? So we started the business in 2015 when we were doing that cross-border business with Bitcoin. And about 6 months after that, we evolved to focusing on just DLT for enterprise. But I think the more important sort of aspects in question in there is how long does it really take to go from idea to actual implementation? And again, that's very dependent on all the factors that we discussed and who you're selling to. The sales cycle for a bank could be much longer than a year. The sales cycle to a small fintech company to onboard them could be 2 days. So it varies tremendously. But in our experience, from actual idea concept to implementation in production has been around the 9 months to 12 months mark. So I think that's all we have time for, and thanks again to everyone for taking the time to listen in. We'd be happy to answer more of your question face-to-face or over email at some other point.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Brennan, for this great session on how to get buy-in from various parties to join a permissioned blockchain network. That's all we have time for today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.